There we go. Thank you. I'm amazed that I didn't really think about it when we were setting this panel up, but we have three speakers here who collectively have over, I did that math right, hopefully, over 100 years of joint experience in solar and or power industry. So excellent choice of speakers, if I may say so myself. To my immediate left is Paul Detering. He's the CEO of CODA Energy. Tom Leyden, who's the VP of Energy Storage Deployment at SunEdison. I think when we reached out to Tom, he was in between sort of changing job titles, going from solar grid storage to SunEdison. And we've been joined by Gerrit Nicholas, who's the president of CODA DG. So we'd be sharing some interesting perspectives from the side of the developers and integrators and vendors, and as well as Gerrit, who will hopefully share his perspective as a financier. So very briefly, I'd start off with the history of solar financing or energy financing in general, and like you all to talk about some of your experiences in your previous roles and how they've helped you to take over your respective new jobs. So starting with you, Paul, I read that at CODA Energy, you helped raise over $400 million for corporate as well as project funding. So how does the financing work differently on the corporate side versus project funding, given that CODA right now has done some project funding rounds too?
Yeah, I think, am I on? Am I live? Yes? Now I am. Clearly, the types of investors that in the long run want to invest in projects versus sort of corporate are different. The risks are different. The yields are ultimately going to be different. And you see that in solar. As solar sort of matured, it bifurcated, and you had people who really wanted to own assets, the assets that had a different risk profile and therefore a different yield expectation from sort of the investing in the corporation. I think at this stage it's still very early, and in fact, in storage it's still very early, and so you still see a lot of blending of the two, and in fact, in some ways, the risk profiles are very similar. But I think that those will bifurcate as well. Today, what we do at CODA, we've got investors that are providing us with sufficient capital so we can use it both for corporate purposes, in other words, hiring sales and marketing people, engineering people, as well as investing in the project. So we currently own the projects on our balance sheet, but we're in active conversations with funds and entities who want to own assets. And one of the big differences I see from the solar days back in 06, 07, 08 is that I see that happening here in storage much more quickly. And I'll stop there because I think we'll probably end up talking about that.
Absolutely. So you think it's going to happen sooner or at least quicker in storage. What's so different about storage than solar that you think it's going to happen quickly?
It isn't so much that what's different. It is that having gone through the solar experience and having attracted, that asset class has attracted a lot of interest. People over time, investors over time, came to realize that it was a very interesting asset class with very stable cash flows, very attractive returns, very attractive yields, and so a lot of capital has come to that market. And I would suggest that in fact there is more, and specifically in the commercial industrial space, there is more capital than there are actually great projects. That same capital now is looking at storage and saying, okay, maybe I should be looking at this new asset class. So the interest is there. The hurdles of actually getting those funds put to work are not insignificant, because as people start to dig in and they start really understanding the asset class, they come back to some of the same issues that we looked at back in the early days of solar, which is, all right, what's the risk? And again, I'll pause because as we start talking through the risks, there's similarities, but there's big differences as well.
Absolutely, and I'd love to get into that once we get around all the speakers here. So Tom, going on to you, and again, I mentioned earlier that you have had multiple decades of experience in the solar industry. What are the biggest pitfalls that you saw in the solar industry, and are they the same in the storage financing world as well?
Well, I think people are getting tired of hearing about the parallels with the solar industry, with the storage industry, but it is true. There's so many parallels. Back in 2000 when I started with Powerlight, I sold a 50 kilowatt system. That was the largest system in the country for a while. We're doing gigawatts now. That's a really exciting prospect. But in the early days of solar, it was really hard to get solar finance because it was a new technology and people weren't comfortable with the revenues that it produces. But 10 years later, Warren Buffett's making $2 billion investments in solar because it's very predictable. So now what's happening in storage, it's a new asset class. Anything new has risk, and investors are not yet comfortable with it. And in fact, it's kind of hard to monetize some of the multiple benefits that storage can provide. And until they get comfortable with it, it's going to be costly or difficult. So I'm in the world of SunEdison now that has a yieldco. This is the new world in solar, which is fantastic. These solar companies are now owning the generation for long term, and that's a huge shift. But these yieldcos are, by design, very conservative. And so they need certain contracted revenue, which you get from solar PPAs or wind PPAs. And so that's most of the projects going in are long contracted revenue projects. Storage doesn't have long contracted revenues. So my challenge within SunEdison now is we need to figure out how we get that kind of certainty so that we can go into the yieldco, which is a low-cost way to finance renewable projects.
And yet manage to get sustainable revenue streams?
That's the trick. How do you make sustainable revenue streams? What we did at Solar Grid Storage and why SunEdison acquired us, we were on the East Coast in PJM. We were bidding into the frequency regulation markets, a very robust market that has good revenue, but it's not contracted revenue. So the investors that we had at the time were willing to take that risk, but we paid a high price for that. SunEdison's not going to do that in their yieldco. I mean, we'll find other ways to do it, obviously, but I need to find, my job at SunEdison is to figure out how we get those contracted revenues or how we get the yieldco comfortable with storage revenues. And when we do, it's groundbreaking.
Got it. I'll come back to that yieldco relation and PJM market participation. But first I want to get to Gerrit. So you come from a different background, right? You've been in the power industry, and even the financing that you've done on the renewable side in the past has been on utility scale solar projects. But your first funding sort of partner on the storage side, Green Charge Networks, is behind the meter CNI storage model. What made you make that jump going from funding large megawatt, multi-megawatt scale projects to now funding projects that are probably few tens of kilowatts?
Yeah, the transition was actually pretty simple for us because our history is of being developers and investors in companies and projects, but usually not very early stage like venture capital, but not later stage like a fully developed, robust, market. So in utility scale solar, we found a niche in developing large scale solar projects at a time when it still was a little bit dicey in exactly how they were going to get financed and how the tax equity was going to work. And so it was a good spot for us. As the market evolved and the yieldcos came together and the cost of capital for solar came way down as the perceived risks of solar came way down, it just wasn't the best place for a developer like us to be. So our cost of capital is higher, and the margins were all being compressed, and we just thought there would probably be opportunity elsewhere. So we started to look around. We divested of our solar assets to essentially yieldcos and manufacturers that have since built yieldcos. And we started looking at what's the next trend. And, this conference and lots of the activities that folks in this room are involved in were what we also saw as the opportunity. And we started looking at storage. And, storage, both Paul and Tom have hit on it. Storage really is tracking a similar pattern that solar did. The big difference is that you don't have quite the contractual structures in place in storage that you have in solar. But I think that will evolve as technology evolves and as the market's comfort with those risks evolve. I mean, I can remember it wasn't even that long ago, 08, 9, 10 even, financing solar, they were like, yeah, but what about all that construction risk? And you looked at them and said, what construction risk? Of course, today, nobody even thinks about construction risk in solar. And we have the same sort of challenges in storage. But for us as investors, it seemed like this is about to take off. This is a massive global market. This technology is actually pretty well understood. It's really how you deploy it, how you implement it, and how you control it, which is where our investment really was focused. And if you get that right, there's a huge opportunity, and the same thing's going to happen as the yields decline, and those who got in early and developed the pipeline are going to have a real monetization opportunity.
Sure. Yeah.
I'll give you another parallel with the solar industry, and that is, back in 2000, the early 2000s, commercial systems was the way to reduce the cost of those projects. And then, lo and behold, like 10 years away, residential is now driving the solar sector big time. Mm-hmm. It's really interesting. And I think the same thing is going to happen in storage. And what we've been focusing on are larger, half megawatt, megawatt type systems, 1 megawatt to 10 megawatts, say. And that is the most cost-effective way to do it right now. But what Gerrit's doing on residential, and SunEdison's going to be doing as well, is like, if the residential solar industry is growing like crazy, you want to find a way to get a storage solution in there as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that comment, Tom. I'd like to go back to you, Gerrit, for a second. My question still remains that agreed we are talking about a different asset class, solar versus storage, but how did you sort of go about making that decision from we are going to sponsor 1 or 2 big solar projects back in the day to now potentially sponsoring hundreds of...
I see. Okay, sorry if I missed that. Yeah, it wasn't really, we didn't wake up one day and say, oh gosh, we don't want to do big projects anymore. We like to do lots of little ones. In fact, we don't like to do that. But that said, that's where the market's headed. That's where the market opportunity is. And the sort of the leap you make is if you can deploy, instead of, we used to build, 1,000 megawatt power stations, right? But you have to build a lot of little storage facilities to get to 1,000 megawatts. But if you do, and if you can centrally control them through a network, and effectively deploy them from a central, operating center, it's the same thing. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a lot of brain damage getting there, but the margins are compelling, and I think the market is massive. So those were really the criteria we were looking for. Rather than look for one big project, just make sure you have one big market where you have a compelling return. And it was the same decision-making process once you got through that.
Sure.
Yeah, let me build on that, because coming from the solar world where we were in the commercial and industrial space, we thought a lot about the differences between sort of the big utility projects versus sort of commercial scale projects. And one of the things that I've observed is that often, companies in the commercial space, sort of the founders, the people they hire sort of come from having done big projects. And I'm going to oversimplify, but the processes and sort of structures they bring is sort of a mentality that says, we can do this with spreadsheets and email. And if you're going to do thousands and tens of thousands of little projects, that'll never work. And you have to build a flow business. You have to have a business where you don't think of it as a series of big projects that you sort of move through, where it takes a few years, to move each one through the process. but rather that it's continuous flow. The residential solar people completely get that, right? The ones that are at the forefront, the names that we all know. In fact, I think Sunrun filed for their IPO today. Those kinds of companies completely get that it has to be a process business, a flow business. And I would argue that in the long run, it's actually much more attractive to be in the commercial space than it is in the big project space. So as a developer, you can really do well, but you got to go in and out of the market and when you're doing big projects, because what happens is there's a dearth of projects. You can you can make good money, and then there's too many people piling in, and prices go down, margins get compressed. It's not that interesting. Whereas in commercial and residential, I think the companies that build the infrastructure, the processes, the systems are building sustainable competitive advantage that's going to give them the ability to continue to sustain those margins that we're seeing. Maybe not at the levels that we're currently seeing, because they will get compressed, but I think you will have sustainability.
Sure. And sustainability in terms of revenue, right? That's what I want to come back to, Paul. Most of the projects, or I'm assuming all the projects you've deployed so far, are catered towards demand charge reduction. But when you're looking at an individual CNI customer on whose site you're deploying these systems, demand charge reduction is, you can sort of predict on what's the potential and what's the returns for the end customer, but it's not an exact science yet, right? One hot day and the AC you have to turn on when it's during peak demand period, and suddenly your savings are out of the window, right? So how do you sort of mitigate for that and prove your end customers as well as a financier to make sure that the returns are sustainable?
Yeah, I think, so a couple of thoughts. One is the quality of the algorithms that you use that are running, that are operating, which sort of determine and say, is this a peak or is this not a peak? How big of a peak is it going to be? Should I shave this peak? How much of the peak should I shave? What happens if I'm partway through, shaving a peak and things aren't behaving the way I thought they were going to behave? What do I do? So adaptive algorithms and the quality of those algorithms is critical. And the kind of people that we hire are literally rocket scientists. And we just hired someone from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory who's been doing algorithms forever. So we just added him to the team. So that's a piece of it. But the other piece of it is, how do you now, over time, demonstrate that your algorithms work? And that is time. And you can show that empirically as you develop a base of a lot of assets, and you can look back. But you can also show it with individual assets, and you can actually track individual assets and show what the algorithm is doing on a case-by-case basis. So you show it both ways. And then finally, the other piece is that you're doing this across a lot of assets. So you're not trying to finance a single 50 kilowatt hour tower that's in a retail operation. You're trying to finance a pool. And so you're taking advantage of the law of large numbers and getting an aggregated pool to finance against.
Great. So, whenever we talk about algorithms, you have to talk about data, right? The role of data.
Yep.
What's the role of data, and who has that data? How do you get access to it? How does that fit into your sort of project or portfolio life cycle?
So we start with getting access to the data that we get in California, green button data, 15-minute interval data. We run that through a different set of algorithms, which is trying to predict what the savings are going to be, which those algorithms are meant to mirror the actual running on operating algorithms. And then we gather data on an ongoing real-time basis, both about the load, about what our systems are doing, but also other data, sort of data about sort of the environment that the system is running in. And you can pull a lot of different pieces. And that's where sort of the quality of your algorithms and the way you think about it becomes really interesting. So it isn't just about the weather and the load and tracking the load. You can pull a lot of other very interesting sources of data to try and use that to make your adaptive predictive algorithms better over time.
Sure.
And we control that data. We own that data.
Got it. Tom, I know back in the day, solar grid storage, I'm assuming you still have that award from DOE to work on the NOC. Can you share some details on where it stands and what's the role of data building that NOC?
Sure. So we won a Sunshot grant with Department of Energy to build a network operations center that can aggregate large and small storage assets. And so we're working on that now with SunEdison. SunEdison has this amazing renewable operations center now that operates its 5 gigawatts of wind and solar around the world. But what we're going to do is we're going to bolt onto that this ability to communicate with storage systems throughout the country, throughout the globe, I guess, and to be able to aggregate them. So in a place like PJM, you could have a small and a large system aggregated together as a single asset. It could be in Illinois and Maryland, and acts as one asset. So, and this is just part of the evolution of the grid, right? I mean, this is exactly the kind of stuff that's going to happen. There's been a lot of discussion about that this week, about interactivity, the connection of devices, and generation assets, and we're going to be in that game. I mean, that's what we intend to do with our SROC, Storage Renewable Operations Center.
You heard it first, I suppose. So your PJM assets, right? Coming back to PJM discussion here, how do you incorporate for the what's essentially a wholesale market, right? And financiers, from my understanding, try to run away from wholesale markets, and to top, we are talking about a new asset category. Can you sort of talk about the challenges that you saw in your early projects back in your solar grid storage days, and how you're trying to mitigate those risks?
Yeah, again, another parallel with solar. In the early days of solar, to building commercial solar projects, you're building a financial pro forma, and you have various things to call upon: the tax credit, the meter, turning the meter. At Powerlight, we created some value for the roof savings that we had with our product and thermal savings. So you just stack all these benefits. Storage has like 30 different functions that it could provide that are valuable. And what you're seeing now in the storage industry is stacking the few that we can monetize now. So demand reduction is one. In PJM, it's frequency regulation. We provided inverter services for the PV developer, so they paid us for that. So it's really a matter of stacking enough revenues where you can build a financial model that's acceptable to an investor. Now, how do you mitigate the risk? You could hedge. Find a hedge, which we're doing now. We're trying to do. But you can also look at ways that over time, as you build up your assets and you have this large virtual storage asset, that you can bid into other markets like the capacity markets. So it's a matter of convincing investors that the market now is good and solid. I can't predict 5 years from now what it's going to be. I mean, I stopped predicting about the solar industry and what we're going to do because it's just so dynamic. But there are other ways to monetize the asset that provide some comfort to the investor.
Sure. And have those tools changed over the years, in the 4 or 5 years you've been doing this? And now you're part of a bigger company?
The rules?
The tools.
The tools, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
No, not really. I mean, we know what our revenues are. We know what our capabilities are. It's a battle that you always fight in the generation business. It's like, what's your cost of goods sold? What are your revenues? Mm-hmm. And those may change over time. Markets will expand as COGS go down. So it's really kind of the same thing, just different inputs.
Sure. There's one more sort of commonality between Tom and Gerrit here. Yesterday, I believe you probably are aware of it, but I'll make it. I'll mention it for the audience. Green Charge Networks and SunEdison announced this partnership where SunEdison would be financing the solar portion of a solar plus storage system, and Green Charge Networks would be financing the storage piece of it. Assuming that's through the fund that CODA has participated in. How do you see this financial engineering work out? We're talking about two different assets here. potentially at different life cycles and different functions and applications that are being stacked together. Is this the best way to go forward, bringing in two different parties to finance the two portions of a same system? I'd like both of your comments here, but start with Gerrit here.
Sure. Well, I think it makes some sense today because SunEdison has a fabulous solar product that mitigates costs on or reduces costs on the energy side, and Green Charge Networks has a fabulous product that helps customers, C&I customers, reduce costs on the capacity side, on the demand side, and they're really two different revenue streams, and they can be measured differently, and they can be analyzed separately. So, and in some cases, you have customers that really just need storage. In some cases, they just want solar, and in some cases, they can benefit from both. So, I think that alliance that was announced yesterday there's already a ton of interest from folks that Green Charge is out providing storage for that would actually like to get some solar. And now they have a one-stop shopping type approach, and vice versa. The SunEdison obviously has a huge pipeline of existing customers and new customers that would like to have storage tacked on. What we're seeing in the market is that because of the interest in the sort of new interest in storage, and a lot of that's been created by those who've been tracking it, but then general public now is very aware because of all the hoopla from Tesla, and that's all been very helpful, really, because what it does is creates awareness and it creates momentum. And now, if you go in and bid a solar project, the first thing they ask is, well, do you have storage too? Or you have storage. Well, gosh, we'd kind of like to have solar if they don't already have it. And so that alliance was really designed and created to meet that market demand, and we're already seeing results from it.
Great. One comment I'd like to bring from yesterday's panel on distributed assets, where the speaker from Solar City mentioned that storage is a way for them to install more solar. How does that fit into the equation, and more so from the financing side? Does it impact the financing, given if solar is attached to storage, or how does it enable an end customer?
Well, I don't know, Tom, what you think, but look, it doesn't necessarily make it simpler, right? Because there's actually more complexity. So,
right.
But that doesn't mean it's not manageable. And I think I did hear the person from Solar City say that, and I think what he was referring to was the fact that you go out and you pitch solar, and you lose the deal because you didn't pitch solar and storage. And we've seen that in the market where solar, not just SunEdison, but others have come to us and said, to Green Charge and said, look, we want to be able to pitch you guys alongside us because we're finding that that's what the market wants. And I think that's what they were referring to, although he wasn't quite as definitive.
Sure, but then, like you said, the deal gets more complicated or complex, and does it make the financing easier though for the sort of other criteria the same when you're selecting the end customer?
I don't think it makes the financing easier, no. But I think it's manageable, and I think over time, we haven't talked about it yet, or in any depth, but financing of storage projects is coming fast. It is coming very fast. And a year ago, you call up a bank and say, you want to finance storage, and they don't, what's that? And today they're saying, oh yeah, we really, really want to, but I've got to get comfortable with X, Y, and Z. But so the change is fast. And then there's a lot of different places in the capital structure where there is a ton of interest that's already ready to write checks. Okay. Not quite at the commercial banks. There are some actually, but there's a lot of others that are interested. So I think to answer your question, I think they're going to be 6 months from now, they're going to be a lot of folks that are financing storage, and that will just make that sort of technology evolve so that becomes even simpler on the integration with the solar.
Got it. Tom, your opinion now. Yeah.
First of all, we're really excited about our relationship with Green Charge Networks. It's a great company. We really look forward to working with them. We're all in on storage. We're all in on solar, wind, renewables. And this is one of the many things that the company's going to be doing in the storage space. So there'll be others. Solar grid storage was about combined solar plus storage together with a single inverter. I mean, there are a lot of different models. We're interested in pursuing anything that makes sense for the company. And in particular, we're looking for projects that we can get into our yieldco. And so, you know, there's a whole world of interesting opportunities out there.
Great. How will the O&M impact the structure, right? Again, we're talking about a system which either uses one inverter or two, and we have asset solar which can last for 20 years without replacement, but storage potentially requires more frequent replacement. Who's responsible for O&M? How does it impact the financing? Is it built into the financing model? By default, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's interesting you're digging into this so closely. It is different in terms of the O&M. There's no question about it. I mean, batteries don't last 20 years, so there, you know, there'll be issues there. We as a company are going to have to evolve that as well and figure out how to deal with that. But you know, we've got the global service team that is awesome. With Green Charge Networks and this deal, they're going to take care of the O&M for that part of the product. In fact, they're financing that piece for us. So you know, this is a really good way for us to get into demand-side management. As Gerrit said, our customers were asking for it, so we want to provide a service for them.
Excellent. Do you have anything else to add there, Gerrit? Otherwise, I can ask the same question to Paul.
Well, I'm sure Paul has a view as well. The O&M is on the storage side. O&M itself is not a big piece of the equation. Batteries do degrade, just like solar panels degrade. There are formulas, there are warranties, there's predictability. It all can be managed and forecast pretty effectively. So it's not really an issue, and it's a pretty low-cost piece of the puzzle.
Sure. And Paul, I'm assuming that CODA has done some projects where solar was part of it, either right from the word go or was installed before storage. Have you had to deal with issues around, you know, how would the O&M be structured if you've gone with a partner, or?
Yeah, we have done projects. We do projects combined with solar. You know, I'll say that whenever you do it, the level of complexity increases as the square of the number of resources, the DER resources. So there you go. There's a new law. As you increase the DER, the complexity increases as a square.
Sure. I'm assuming the returns too, but
the returns are increased as an exponential.
Perfect. Yeah.
So it's even better. The O&M piece, I really don't see that. The pure O&M, I don't see that as an issue. There's a little bit of complexity if you're using one inverter, and if you're trying to finance it, obviously, with two different sources of financing. That's interesting, but I don't know how often you're going to really see that. I think where, you know, O&M in the storage world, when you're doing the kinds of things that we're doing and talking about sort of layering, you know, up to 30 different revenue streams, the O of O&M, which is operations, that's where the real complexity is, and that's where the real opportunity is, and that's where it's very different in storage than it is in solar. You know, replacing batteries, I don't know how much different that is than replacing an inverter after 10 years.
Sure. Okay. But it's still a cost, though, right?
Yeah, sure. You just use one of those fancy tools called an Excel spreadsheet, and you plug it in. You say, I'm assuming I'm going to have to replace it after X years.
Sure.
I just want to add, I actually think it makes sense to have a single inverter for solar plus storage. It's just that it's early in the development in the industry, and so there are not a lot of products out there that do that. But you know, on the East Coast, it's really about emergency power backup. With solar and storage, you could do that, right? You separate from the grid, and now you have backup power and all the power that the solar can provide during that time. So that's a really important aspect of what we do. And at SunEdison, you know, our interest in storage is that we want to enable more solar and wind because that's where we think the utility sector is going, and that's where our focus is. We could do standalone storage as well, so that could be you know, a separate business unit. But we're very, very keen on, you know, much greater penetration of renewables on the grid, and we're going to see that, in my lifetime, thank God.
Great. We are nearing to the end of the panel. I would like each one of you to comment on one question from my end, and then we'll open up for the audience. What's going to be the next wave? We are talking about in the coming wave, right, in storage financing. Are we talking about, we mentioned yieldcos here, but are we talking about the next IPO from a storage company? Are we talking about a different structure approach towards storage financing?
Can we start?
Yeah, let's start from here.
Yeah, I think financing storage in behind-the-meter commercial, and I think my comments will apply generally to residential as well. It is going to be different than what we've seen in solar, because in solar, essentially, you put the panels up on the roof, or if you're doing a parking structure, you build the parking structure, put the solar panels up there, connect it to an inverter, the sun shines, you monitor it, you watch how many electrons go by, count them, send a bill, right? And so taking this to an extreme, you can say, okay, if I want to get someone who wants to put this on their balance sheet, who wants to finance it, they can do that, and they can take that asset over. And that individual or that entity could be anywhere, and they're essentially clipping coupons. They need to contract with someone to do the O&M. With storage, if you're trying to monetize these 30 different revenue streams, and you've got these algorithms that are trying to optimize peak shaving, but not just peak shaving, you're trying to optimize the 29 others, and not only are you trying to optimize all 30, you're trying to optimize all 30 together to try and figure out what's the best way to use these assets. That requires a set of infrastructure, software, data, and systems and processes to manage that. And so the concept of just sort of having a passive investor own it isn't going to be there. And so I think you're going to see interesting models emerge where there is going to be a lot of capital that's interested in this. But then the question is, how do you share in sort of, one structure could be, okay, there's sort of a threshold yield that the financing entity, the fund, the capital wants, and then there's an upside, right? And so one structure is you say, okay, let's take a carried interest approach to this, so that the operator of the asset has a vested interest in operating these efficiently and shares in the upside, and then the provider of capital, gets their desired coupon, and then has, another slug of potential upside, which is, is increased, basically increases their potential yield.
Sure.
So I think that's one area you're going to see. Now the flip side is, so if you're not doing it with solar, right? The bad news is there's no ITC. The good news is there's no ITC. And so the complexity that the tax equity folks introduced,
right,
from my perspective, thank God that's gone. Because you can't see, but I've got a lot of gray hair because of dealing with the tax equity folks.
Sure.
Yeah, I think in the not too distant future, you're going to see the ability to finance solar plus storage in coincidence, a 20-year PPA, as an example. But let me tell you again about yieldcos, right? Yieldcos are meant to provide dividend to shareholders, right? And so when you add solar and storage together, and you have these multiple ways you can monetize storage, which you didn't have before, that throw off cash, yieldcos are all about cash available for distribution, CAFD. Get used to that term. In fact,
it's
First Solar, First Solar and SunPower, that's their symbol for Wall Street. But when you're able to generate that additional revenue or cash, it's hugely valuable, because those yieldcos have a multiplying effect when you have cash available for distribution, the dividends that they provide their shareholders. So it's huge.
Excellent. Gerrit, last remarks from you?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a lot to add to what these guys said already, but it will evolve. Financing in storage will evolve as the certainty of the cash flow, the CAFD per se, or the free cash flow becomes more and more certain. And that is in part a function of comfort around the technology and the performance of the technology and the algorithms and everything else, and how that matches with the tariff. And then the tariff, of course, has regulatory risk associated with it. So as you can diversify away from the regulatory risk, be it in some sort of a tradable market for grid services, DR, or demand charge, whatever it is that will evolve, that will start to help to create that cash flow certainty. And then as you do that, you'll start to be able to, you can apply these projects to the lower yield type vehicles, or a portion, as Paul suggests, to the lower yield vehicles. That'll create a lot of efficiency in the financing and a lot of upside for the equity. So that's where it's going.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We have 5 minutes for questions from the audience. We have a couple of mics around. One right here, please.
When the three of you are looking into developing, researching, investing different storage technologies, what role does, what role does externalized costs play into your decision making? So, for example, environmental costs, end-of-life costs, high production costs. How big? What's the role that plays in your decision making?
You want to answer that, Paul?
Who wants to take it? Gerrit, you want to?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it plays a big role, right? I mean, we're investors. We're not investors in like quote unquote new technology. So if something is very, still in the laboratory or still in pilots or trials, that's not something we would look at. But if it's beyond that, where the technology can really truly be verified and it's ready for commercialization, then those sorts of questions become important questions, because as an investor for a long-term asset ownership, which is the way we approach investment, you need to know, and at least need to think about the life cycle of what you're doing. And you can have a superbly profitable business for 10 years and then have a huge liability at the end that blows away everything you earned in the previous 10 years. So we think about that stuff for sure. And that's why we try to go with technologies. I mean, both in the case of, solar seemed like it was a brand new technology to everybody, 5 years ago or 6 years ago, when in fact it's been around for 50 years, right? So, lithium-ion batteries is a similar story. That's maybe not 50 years, but it's been around a long time. It's been in our cell phones. It's been in our appliances and so forth. So, that gives you some comfort, but then you have to do the math and you have to look at what the potential risk could be and factor all that in.
Excellent. Oh, sure.
Stephen Kapp from San Diego. On the benefit stacking and the 30 examples of the benefits of batteries, I'm thinking of the solar plus storage dynamic, where you've got your peanut butter and jelly, you've got your Reese's peanut butter cup, whatever analogy we've got here, we see a nice yin and yang. So having said that, normally we're looking at demand charge reduction as a investable type of application, if you will. I'm also wondering if one of those benefit stacking things is not the additional revenue from it, but the risk reduction. So we have utilities changing demand charges and other rate schemes and general rate cases. So from the investment community, you might say, well, that sort of makes it less fundable if we have this dynamic, this variable that just like if the SGIP program went away, you wouldn't be playing this market, I would imagine. So for the same reason, if the rates do something dynamic, the market might suddenly close up for you. To what extent does not only the investment community, but the end users see the storage application having the ability to minimize the risk from the variability of rates? I mean, we have not only technology changes, the integration challenges, now we have regulatory things, and we also have within that, from an end use perspective, playing around with the rates that can adversely affect the economic model that was originally envisioned. To what extent does storage actually benefit to that as well, to add to the rationale for solar plus storage, or just storage to a typical site?
It's definitely an issue. There's regulatory risk for sure. Again, parallels with solar. And I can't predict what's going to happen on regulation. I mean, there's some issue now with net metering, when you have storage behind the meter, that you can't export at that time, when you're behind the meter. And solar's in operation. So that's regulatory risk. And again, I said it earlier, I think because there are multiple ways to monetize the asset, that does provide some comfort. But investors are not going to get entirely comfortable with this for a few years. So it's going to take just some time to wring out some of the risk and the concerns that investors have.
To add clarity to that, I mean the fact that batteries could bank the power to strategically provide it when most advantageous to the customer, maybe investment, that's within the parameters of their control, yet also still a variable tool now in their toolbox they didn't have before that allows them to reduce the risk. Add that clarity.
That's right. You know, and utilities are using demand charges now as a form of revenue for them, obviously. And if we start getting really good at reducing demand charges, they're going to find some other way to, make up that revenue. I mean, Arizona utility today told us 21 cents a month. $21 a month if you're a solar customer.
Paul, you had something to add there, I suppose.
Yeah, I just a couple things. So first of all, from a customer's perspective, our model is that we finance, own, and operate the assets, so the customer doesn't put anything up. And so to the extent there's, changes in tariffs, they don't really take that risk, right? And I think your point is valid in the sense that an intelligent, networked storage asset that's behind the meter can do a lot of different things. And so as they move, as the game is changed, you have the ability to sort of adjust. I think in terms of getting investors comfortable, one of the things that I've had success with, and in storage I would say it's early days, is going back to sort of fundamentals. Because at the end of the day, the regulators, not always, but in general, are going to be driven by the fundamental economics that drive the cost of operating a grid, right? And so if we sort of go in and capture a lot of the revenue that's on the demand charges today, and they go in and they say, well, you know what, we're just going to take all demand charges to zero. There's a reason that demand charges are there, because they're there to address part of the cost structure that underlies the operation of the grid. So I think when you go back to fundamentals, that's where you can start getting comfortable that those risks can be mitigated. And I think you're right. I mean, they can. It's like whack-a-mole, right? So you whack down one mole, well, you got another one to go hit.
All right, we over time, but I think there was a question right there, so we'll end with that.
Nigel Etherington, Planet and Company. So this has been an interesting panel for me. My question is motivated by the comments from which I'm hearing that investment in energy storage is going to be increasing. And I can see a big difference between behind the meter and adding storage and solar, and the last mile of the grid where you're trying to stabilize. And going to the comment that Paul made, either only 3 main markets of maybe 30 different benefits or applications. My question is, do you really think that the problem that the storage will be solving when it goes in is going to be the same problem or demand profile in 3, 4, 5 years as it starts as storage starts to improve, but the problem that you thought you were solving is going to modify over time? Hopefully that's clear.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about this is that the grid, our electricity system, we've never had storage, fundamentally. I mean, there's been a little bit, but fundamentally we haven't had it. And that's been one of the real problems with the electric grid, because you can't store it, right? So you got to generate it when you need it. Whereas you think about, I come from the data networking business, right? So before I moved into renewable energy in 2006, 2007, I was in the data networking business. And, we moved bits around, but we could also store bits of information. And we use storage in the data networking industry in a wide variety of ways. And it creates tremendous flexibility. And so now we're finally bringing storage into the electric system. And so that's just going to open up, a plethora of opportunity. So, today I can't tell you exactly how that's going to evolve, but if you go back 25, 30 years at the beginning sort of, of the IT revolution, or I guess even more than that, 35 years, you could not have predicted all the ways that storing data in the computers and the smartphones that we use was going to evolve.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, but I think that analogy only goes so far, and my concern is that the predictability of the returns that you can see when you've got a PPA behind it are not going to materialize in the last mile of the grid, and that what might be a temporary problem where you put some storage in may therefore require much shorter paybacks in order to attract the investors. So I think we just need to be careful in comparing storage in the last mile of the grid from behind the meter.
I think it's a good point.
Great, excellent. With that, I'd like to thank the speakers for a wonderful last panel here at Grid Edge Live.
We brought it home.